Okay, Psych 250 students, we're back with chapter 1, and we're talking last time about some organizations that promote mental health, like NAMI. This idea that you're not alone. If your family's dealing with or you're dealing with mental health issues, you can get help. So approaching it from more of a societal, familial, community standpoint, as opposed to this, hey, you're sick, just get better, right? Social stigma is pretty interesting. I saw a posting online yesterday that said if there's any kind of mental illness, that will eliminate you from certain jobs. So certain professions, people in those professions, they avoid going to any kind of therapist or anything of that nature because they know that if it gets on their record, they're through. There's no way they're going to get a chance. And that is such a discriminatory practice, right? But that's the reality we're dealing with. When we look at the history of how we approach mental illness, we've made some progress, right? It doesn't mean that the stigma has gone away, but we've made some progress. Early belief was that you were possessed. Going back to the case study of the devil on the wall, it had something to do with some type of demons. And so you needed to extract those demons from you, perhaps through an exorcism. Here we see an early image of one of those activities, or through psychosurgery, right? Psychosurgery. Trephination was often used with this idea that we needed to release. And here's an example of somebody with a hole placed in their head so they can release the spirits, the evil spirits that's influencing. And here you see a couple other techniques of ridding people of their symptoms. This is known as the tranquilizer chair. So if you did suffer from bipolar disorder, you might be placed in that chair for long periods of time, cutting off all your senses as much as possible and restricting movement until you calm down, which is not very therapeutic for the patient, as you can imagine. We went into this notion of witchcraft and a lot of finger pointing when anything was unusual. Some cultures have actually embraced forms of mental illness as special gifts. You know, if you heard voices and you can contact the deceased, whereas others scorned it. You know, that's typical human reaction. What we don't understand, we fear, and what we fear, we attempt to destroy that. You see that in our stories. For example, this comes to mind. Frankenstein's monster, right? Got the wrong brain put in his body, reanimated, and our first instinct was to destroy the monster. We see this time and time again with our storytelling. What we don't understand, we attempt to destroy. Fortunately, we've always had people stand up. And now a lot of us look at our world today and there's so many problems and we wonder, what can I do? I'm just one person. What could I possibly do? And we've had throughout history, we've had civil rights leaders, we've had human rights leaders, we've had people stand up and said, this is wrong. And it starts with the person, and other people add and join and help and support. People like Philippe Pinel. I really like these names because they almost sound like comic book superheroes, right? Peter Parker, Philippe Pinel, right? Philippe Pinel looked at the way we're treating the mentally ill. Now, keep in mind that we literally had warehouses for these individuals. Now, if you were wealthy, you could be placed in a nice convalescent home, treated with the best food and care. But most people when we didn't have any kind of public health system or insurance policies, most people were placed in asylums. And those people were treated brutally. They were often chained, beaten, mistreated. And Philippe Pinel said, this is wrong. Here's a collage of what Mr. Pinel looked like and a famous image of him asking them to take the chains off a mentally ill person. His philosophy was, if you want people to get better, why don't you treat them with dignity and respect? Why don't you give them good quality food, fresh air, as opposed to treating them like an animal? Let's be honest, if you're treated like an animal, how do you respond, right? We've had other people, folks like Benjamin Rush, Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix was a school teacher. She didn't have to deal with online stuff, but she had her hands full with just her profession, but she also contributed to this movement in the United States. You had an individual like Clifford Beers who actually was a patient. Clifford Beers actually was a patient in the asylums. It's a couple images of Clifford Beers, and he wrote a book, and I really like the name of it. It's called A Mind That Found Itself. And a professor of mine mentioned it in lecture. So whenever a professor mentioned a book that I thought was interesting, I immediately ran out and tried to find it and read it because I live and breathe psychology, right? And Clifford Beers probably suffered from bipolar disorder. And during his manic states, he would get very verbal. So when they would put him in an asylum, they would tell him to be quiet, and he couldn't be quiet, right? He saw how various patients were beaten and mistreated, and so he fought for them. He argued in their defense, and they, of course, turned their brutality towards him. And so he took it upon himself to say, you know what, I'm going to write a letter to my legislators complaining about the treatment that I'm getting and my fellow patients are getting at this asylum. And he wrote letters to the head of the asylum, to the mayor, to the governor, to U.S. congressmen. And somebody suggested, and by the way, he had so much energy during his manic state that when he would write a letter, they said if you put the paper page to page, it would go approximately 1 to 2 city blocks written on both sides. So doing a couple pages of notes, not an issue for Clifford Beers. Finally, somebody suggested to him, why don't you put your thoughts in the form of a book? And so he did, called A Mind That Found Itself. And guess what? Somebody brought it to the president's attention and said, have you seen this? We're treating our American citizens horribly in these asylums. And they instituted changes. All these people that I just mentioned made contributions around the world to try to make things better for human beings. Now, we've made some progress and we've learned a lot about mental illness. It's not just the mother's fault because she spends so much time with the children. We know it's a complicated phenomenon. We've got diet, we've got genetics, we've got the stressors of life. We know that the brain is completely involved in this process. When we look at this slice of brain right here, we just see a simple slice and doesn't look very sophisticated, right? But yet we know that there's so many things that this brain can do. The fact that we're watching this via video tells us about the capacity of the brain and the process of inventing these machines where we can do this form of education. But we know that there's a lot of things that can go wrong with the brain, and we learn that through experiments, horrible experiments like lobotomies here. And we learn it through case studies like Phineas Gage. Remember his case study where he had that tapping iron shoot through his head, causing, at least initially, some damage to his prefrontal cortex and changing his personality drastically, where he couldn't control his emotions. So there's a lot to abnormal psychology, and I'm glad we started off with abnormal behavior, because one of the things I'm hoping over the next uh, several chapters and throughout this semester is that you're going to become ambassadors to spread education, to reduce the stigma, to have more empathy and teach people what you learn so they can, before they judge people so quickly and say, look at that guy, what's wrong with him? Is he crazy? Or only crazy people go to see those therapists. No, this person's suffering. What can we do to help them? Now, I'm glad you're watching these videos because I have some guidance to exam 1. Here are the questions from chapter 1 I want you to be able to write your answers to. Now, when I ask you to write your answers to these, I want you to write thorough answers. I always tell people, write answers like I'm Forrest Gump. I don't understand, so be explicit. Give me details. Throw in the kitchen sink if you need to. So, first question I'm going to ask you about is, of course, to tell me the devil on the wall case study. Everything you can tell me about that case study, as well as your opinion if the person was mentally ill or not. I think you can do that. Another question I'm going to ask you from chapter 1 is to write about 2 of those pioneers. Now, there's more than just the 4 that I showed you, but I want you to write in detail about 2 of the pioneers and what did they do to try to make a difference. I appreciate you watching, and I hope that you're looking forward to chapter 2 like I am. Take care.